I'm very glad to be here. I'm the Green Party candidate in Midlands North West. I'm a sitting councillor in Dundalk Town Council. I was elected to Louth County Council in 2009 and spent a pretty eventful year in the Senate as well. Can I just get some water? Sorry, Michael, thanks. My track record of involvement in environmental issues probably goes back, probably corresponds really to my time as someone in the public focus. In 1994, after Greenpeace and Lancashire County Council lost a case to stop the Thorpe facility at Sellafield from being commissioned to reprocess nuclear fuel from the new generation of nuclear power stations that were at that time coming on stream. Myself and 3 other people from Dundalk took an action in the High Court to test the nature of transboundary pollution legislation at the time and the jurisdiction that the Irish courts might have on transboundary pollution. We were well advised by some local legal people, but really it was the 4 of us doing it after a long, I suppose, history of campaigning on the nuclear issue in a very localised way. Thorpe, the case lasted 11 years. It went to the Supreme Court. We had a 5-judge Supreme Court make a ruling in 1996, 2.5 years after the case started, saying that the Irish courts did have jurisdiction in regard to pollution emanating from a facility in another state, and that was a huge moment for us. BNFL challenged us every inch of the way, constantly reframed the argument, took us back into court on several occasions, and eventually our resources and just didn't and couldn't go any further. Our legal team, which included Paul Callan, Michael Ford, and our solicitor, who was James McGill at the time, had spent years doing this with us, almost as fellow campaigners, and in the end we entered into an agreement after Ivan Yates in Leinster House and the Minister for Energy in Britain gave commitments. The British Minister gave a commitment that Thorpe would cease reprocessing by 2018, and it was repeated in the Dáil at the time. So we watched that date with interest. So what did we achieve? Well, we achieved a significant transboundary pollution jurisdiction ruling, and we got a timeline on Thorpe finishing reprocessing. Did we shut it? No, far from it. Did we lose our houses? No, we didn't. So, we achieved something. I suppose that there was a large bit of risk-taking and all of that. And at the time, I kind of looked, I suppose I did it in a way because I didn't think politics really worked in the environmental sphere. That was my genuine belief at the time, that I was better off agitating outside than involving myself inside. But I changed my view and saw how small parties can be effective, mainly through watching the PDs, actually. Not that they were effective in a way that I agreed with, but they were effective. And I, at that stage, decided I'd try and involve myself with the Greens and stood for election in 2004. So my political and environmental activism are absolutely intertwined. In regard to then legislation that needs to be dealt with in the next 5 years, I think there are a couple of key underlying items about how we measure prosperity, how we measure economic development, how we decouple ongoing prosperity from carbon emissions, how we decouple prosperity even from growth rates that are impossible to achieve, and yet most conservative political parties in particular continue to aspire after them. I think the notion of long-going, on-term economic growth of the order of 3%, 4%, 5% probably isn't possible and certainly isn't sustainable, and we need to imagine and legislate for not against growth per se, but for ways in which we can measure prosperity that isn't narrowly confined to pure economic activity, that does take in, for instance, the state of our habitat, that does put a value on what bees do, as I'm guessing you were saying, Marion, that really tries to quantify what the ecosystem that we live in, what the biosphere that we are supposed to be part of really means to us. and how it underpins our economy. I think that whole debate around growth, the limits to growth and environment is a really, really critical one. And I know it's been started, and I know at an academic level it's been going on for many, many years, but I don't really think politics has the language yet to deal with all of that. And I'd love to be part of that debate, which, again, I know the Greens, there's about 55 of them in the European Parliament. This is their normal speak, I guess. So it's not new to the Parliament, but it's something certainly that I, as an Irish Green, would like to help be part of. In regard to greenhouse emissions, carbon dioxide, and other gases that are increasing the temperature of the Earth, the Greens in Europe are absolutely committed to at least a 55% reduction in emissions by 2030. And there are some interim targets that I looked up earlier on that we go into COP15. The Conference of the Parties in Paris next year with a target of 30% by 2020, and, as I said, 55% by 2030, which is something the EU needs to lead with, but needs to also negotiate for at the global negotiations. That there be legally binding restrictions on the amount nations can emit, and the emissions trading scheme needs a radical reform with floor prices being put on carbon. Now, this brings me to a point that it's difficult to talk about, because the implementation of a carbon levy inevitably is going to affect poorer people more than well-off people. And I just want to say that straight off. And any way in which inequity is increased while environmental goals are being achieved will simply not wash with people. And I know that. Like, I'm a practicing local politician, and you know these things. But at the same time, I think pricing carbon was a significant policy achievement that the Greens drove on in the last Dáil. Is that 10 minutes? 1 minute. Okay. But implementation is everything, and I do think that in that context, the emissions trading scheme needs to be radically overhauled. I don't think that the large corporates are playing a sufficient role in meeting the targets, and as usual, you end up with the people who are hardest hit being the people who can least afford it. Now, there was some hypothecating, some ring fencing of the carbon levy in the last Dáil. At least there were 66,000 houses a year being retrofitted. We were well on our way to the 100,000 a year target, which would have given us a proper national retrofit within the decade, which would have done away with fuel poverty. But that scheme has been cut to hell now, and the levy, not only has it been increased, it's become part of general government revenues. So it is now not only being unjustly implemented, it's also irrelevant to the issue it's supposed to be addressing, which is terrible. On biodiversity, the touchstone issues, I suppose, for ourselves are issues like the health of the bee population, which on a European-wise basis has been falling by 30% a year. There is a partial ban on neonicotinoids.
Yeah, it took me about 2 days to get
which needs to obviously be extended. On GMOs.
There's another question on that coming up.
Okay, I'll leave that. Yes, so some of the points I was hoping to make have been made. The key one is that we change the debate from cost to financing. That if we do, and I hope we do, get a position whereby a decision is made to put these lines under the ground, that the multiple cost compared to overgrounding be financed in a way that recognises the long-term benefit to the state. You know, if we look at it as a 70, 80-year project, let's find a bond issue, a long-term bond issue, and the European Investment Bank has these very, very long-term instruments that will allow us to repay over that period, and that the accrued benefit that the cabling provides, whether it be to carry renewable energy to our cities and towns or for export, that those benefits are used to pay off, a reasonable interest rate on the money raised. So I think we should be talking about how do we finance this, and set aside the kind of bogus argument, and that's the one that has been put forward all the time. Oh, it's going to cost 3 times, 4 times, so therefore we can't even consider it. I don't think we're coming at the argument the right way if we look at it simply in terms of those costs. Economic development does go hand in hand with rolling out power, and I think it is important that we recognise the limits of undergrounding too. If, for instance, a regional opportunity were to arise, the cable needs to be brought back up, the voltage, or the current I should say, needs to change, and that all costs, and then it needs to go underground again and change again. I'm not technically minded in this. I've just been told this by people who do understand electricity. That the flexibility that you might get of overgrounding becomes more expensive to achieve, but again, the argument I gave originally applies there. Look, as a party, our commitment is to 100% renewables by 2050. So obviously, opening up new avenues around fossil fuel is contrary to that policy thrust. We are becoming increasingly desperate in our search for the hydrocarbons that actually power our economy, and I think in Ireland it would be to our benefit in the longer term to really focus on becoming that 100% renewable nation that I think we can become, with enough ingenuity, belief and political leadership. So I think in policy terms fracking is bringing us in the wrong direction. It should be now. There is at a European level, countries have a right to determine their own energy mix, and that's something I learned, I suppose, to my cost a long time ago in dealing with the nuclear issue in Britain. They have the right to be nuclear, and countries in Europe have the right to pursue their own energy mix, just like we have a common agricultural policy. And this will probably annoy some of you who don't see deeper integration as being the route to take. But if we are going to integrate further, I think one area we ought to be doing it in is in a common energy policy, and that we decide as an entity that that the continent, if you like, becomes the renewable continent and leads the way, and it takes advantage of the economic opportunities that come our way from that. Yes. Where's the question? Yes, that a strategic environmental assessment, of course, yes, be carried out, and also in particular in regard to protection of groundwater, that the burden of proof always remain with the extractor, that liability remains with them, and doesn't become a public liability, and that fracking be not seen as the problem, or sorry, as the answer to European competitiveness, but that, as I say already, that we develop ourselves as the renewable continent. The health effects of wind farms are wind flicker. Isn't that the main one?
I'm not
sorry,
thinking
yeah.
about anything.
Sorry, shadow flicker, excuse me. Could I just say that I was involved in, I made a submission to An Bord Pleanála to oppose what I believed was a very, very poorly conceived wind farm in County Louth. It was a 7 megawatt project. It was something I thought long and hard about doing, but I did it in the end because of the proximity of the wind farm to people's houses and the consequent potential effects from shadow flicker. So I shouldn't have got that phrase wrong. So I do believe that these issues are real, and need to be, and that there is such a thing as bad development in wind. There is, and I've given you a working example of one that I opposed. But I also believe that we need to find locations for large wind. Yes, that we have cooperative wind and community-owned wind, that we have tax breaks for people who invest, and there are 150,000 people in Denmark who are availing of tax advantages through their investment in wind. I think we need to come up with these fiscal drivers that help people benefit, that allow communities to own wind, and only when that happens will you get the acceptance of wind. But I do think it has to become a very, very large part of our energy mix in the future. A bit like wealth, the problem with food isn't the amount we have, it's the distribution of it. In terms of wealth, 50%, the lowest 50% of Europeans in income terms live on 5% of European wealth, while 25% of European wealth is owned by 1% of Europeans. Food is the same. If we distribute it and concentrate it on proper and equitable distribution, the pressing issue, the pressing argument that the GM proponents make would disappear. It is a bogus argument, of course it is, and it is all about corporate capture. Why else would you be selling third world or developing world farmers Terminator gene crops, where you have to rebuy every year? Why else would you do that unless you wanted to control them and exploit them and take what little liquidity they have aside from the other wealth in their lives, which I think, as I said at the very start, we ought to be counting. Why would you take that little bit of liquidity off them? It is a rip-off, it's an exploitation, and it's a use of food technology, and it's immoral. There are two GMO types in Europe at the moment that are fairly widespread. There's a maize type, MON 810, and the BASF potato, Amflora. The Greens in the European Parliament in the last term managed to expand the number of reasons for which member states could introduce a ban on their territories to these crops. And I think that they haven't managed to overturn GM and get Europe declared a GM-free zone. But what a powerful statement that would be! And it is doable if the Parliament is populated with enough people who see things the way I see them, and others at this table see them. It would be a fantastic achievement of the European Parliament. I think it would restore a huge amount of faith, which has been so badly sundered by the crisis and the austerity response to the European Union, if Europe could set itself on that course and forget all the waffle they're hearing about the bogus feed the world stuff that they're hearing. Just to finish, Michael, sorry, I mentioned already that individual countries have an expanded set of reasons for banning GMOs. They include threat to biodiversity, and I do believe that gene transfer can and does happen, as well as states carrying out risk assessments and finding that the risk is too high. That is a sufficient reason as well. So there is no reason, Ireland needn't be bullied into this, and IFA or government or anybody else needn't pretend that they are being bullied into it. There is sufficient kit in the armoury to fight this one off, at least at a national level, but we shouldn't be thinking like that. We should be thinking about how we can make Europe GM free. Yeah, I believe that the TTIPs is as serious as this, that it threatens the precautionary principle that underpins almost everything we do in Europe in environmental terms, but also in terms of bringing product to the market. The expectation among European consumers, and this has been proven by survey after survey, is that what's brought to the market is safe. There's a different attitude in many parts of the world, and certainly in the United States, where the marketplace, if it's proven wrong, you can sue. But that's the way. It's almost like an inverse of what we have here. And I do think that, for instance, common recognition of standards, and that's the thrust of this report, will bring down our higher standards to the standards of the lower countries that we're doing these agreements with. And those standards were hard won over many decades, and in the face of huge lobbying. And I've seen it because I worked with Friends of the Earth, doing a little bit of lobbying for just a number of days on the chemical legislation a number of years ago, and every millimetre of ground you win is a success, and to throw it away through a trade agreement, I think would be deeply regrettable and would drag Europe back. And while obviously I see huge merit in trading with other nations, I don't think there's enough focus within Europe on building up and shortening the supply chain, the food supply chain, and many other supply chains too, that can be done on a more local basis. And I really would love to see agreements begin to achieve that, that we shorten those chains, in part in response to the emissions crisis that we have. We have to find ways of doing everything using no fossil fuel, and that's going to be an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. It's probably worth noting that any agreements around the reduction in use of fossil fuels does exclude agricultural, because we still haven't technically solved that. Whether we go for no plough methods, I don't know, but agricultural fuel is not part of the equation in any of this. So that's worth noting. And I know I'm drifting slightly, but that is the direction I think we need to start going in now. Free trade has brought us so far. It has brought whatever with the distributive nature of the wealth, it has brought great wealth to many parts of the world, and that's in the handfuls. That's in the hands of the few, of course. That's a separate matter. But I do think we have to recognise when the law of diminishing returns kicks in all of this, and we begin to shorten our supply chains, not lengthen them further.